the greatest man in the Bible, who challenged God and Moses. In the ancient days when titans walked the earth and monarchs were forged through warfare, there existed one whose name still echoes through the corridors of history: Og, the sovereign of Bashan. He was the final giant in the sprawling territories of Bashan, where mighty fortresses stood sentinel over fertile plains, and his name thundered through valleys like divine proclamation, inspiring both reverence and terror in equal measure. Og was no ordinary mortal. He stood as a colossus among men, a behemoth whose towering silhouette cast shadows across horizons, and whose strength sent tremors through the hearts of the bravest warriors. Legend spoke of his iron bedstead, forged by master craftsmen and adorned with precious stones that caught the light like captured stars. This massive couch measured 13 feet in length and 6 feet in width. Only a being of extraordinary proportions could rest upon such a monument to power, and Og did so with immense pride, for it served as tangible proof of his dominion over Bashan and the lands beyond. During an era when the earth groaned beneath the weight of giants, and men lifted their eyes toward mountains with fearful reverence, Og had not always been the dreaded king that Chronicles would remember. There was a time when he was merely a young titan, raised among the frozen peaks of Mount Hermon, where bitter winds carved his weathered flesh, and eagles soared high as heralds of ancient deities. From his earliest days, Og listened to tales of his lineage, the Rephaim, an ancestral race of imposing beings who had once ruled the earth with absolute authority. They were more than mere warriors. They were living embodiments of power and devastation. His father, a legendary combatant of fearsome reputation, taught him to wield a sword as massive as a tree trunk and to hurl boulders capable of demolishing entire fortifications. "Strength is a gift, my son," his father would counsel, his voice carrying the weight of generations, "but it is not everything. A true king protects his people not only with his fists, but also with his wisdom and his heart." However, Og's destiny was inscribed in the ashes of endless conflicts. The lands of Bashan, rich and prosperous beyond measure, attracted the covetous gazes of kings and conquerors from distant realms. It was not long before the young giant faced his first trial by fire in the vast plains of Argob, where an army of invaders advanced with the intention of claiming what rightfully belonged to others. But Og, with a roar that shook the very foundations of the earth, launched himself into combat. His blade flashed like lightning in the gathering dusk, carving paths of destruction through enemy ranks. The ground became crimson with spilled blood, and the name of Og began to spread like an ominous portent throughout all surrounding nations. Yet this was merely the opening chapter of his saga. Og was not solely a formidable warrior. He was also a master builder. With his own hands, he erected impregnable fortresses and carved roadways through mountainous terrain to connect the far reaches of his kingdom. His iron bed, which would later become the stuff of legend, was crafted by Bashan's finest artisans, who labored day and night to create a resting place worthy of a king, though unknowingly, they also forged what might serve as a tomb. As Og gazed upon the horizon from his throne, he remained unaware that his greatest trial lay ahead. For in the wilderness, an unexpected adversary was rising, a people without permanent homeland but possessed of unshakable faith. This nation was guided by a God who could not be seen, yet whose power manifested through miracles that defied comprehension. Stories reached his ears of this invisible deity who had divided the sea to rescue his chosen people, who had rained fire from heaven and toppled massive walls with nothing but trumpet blasts. These accounts came to Og like whispers of impossibility, yet they carried an unsettling ring of truth that he could not ignore. Og listened with skepticism, but deep within his core, something stirred uneasily. During the dark hours when shadows enveloped his fortress, he dreamed of an army wreathed in divine flames, led by a figure in simple robes carrying a staff that could make the earth tremble. In these visions, his iron bed no longer symbolized his greatness, but appeared as a cold and lonely sepulchre. One fateful day, a messenger arrived before Og's throne, his face pale with terror but his voice steady with the weight of undeniable truth. "My lord," he announced, his words cutting through the stillness of the great hall like a blade, "the Israelites have crossed the Jordan River. They have conquered Jericho with impossible ease. Now they march northward, toward us." Og rose from his seat, his massive shadow stretching across the stone walls like the harbinger of an approaching tempest. "Let them come," he declared, his voice booming through the chamber. "Let them attempt to seize what belongs to me. I shall demonstrate the true power of Bashan." But within his heart, a persistent question gnawed at him like a relentless beast. Was this the enemy his father had warned him about? The one who would test not merely his physical strength, but the very essence of his soul. The days of peace in Bashan began to fade like morning mist before the rising sun. Reports of the Israelite advance arrived with every merchant, every traveler, every spy brave enough to cross the borders of the kingdom. They spoke of no ordinary army. These were not conquerors who triumphed through superior numbers or battlefield prowess alone. Their victories came from something far more mysterious, something that no sword, no fortress wall, no spear could hope to withstand: the will of their God. Og maintained his composure publicly, but during the quiet hours when darkness shrouded his stronghold, doubt crept through the corridors of his mind like living shadows. In his dreams, he witnessed his warriors falling without apparent cause, saw his great iron throne covered in dust, watched his name fading from the annals of history. Then he would awaken with a start, cold perspiration covering his massive frame. "My lord," reported one of his scouts, returning from a dangerous reconnaissance mission, "our watchers have confirmed that the Israelites have indeed crossed the Jordan. They took Jericho effortlessly, and they show no signs of halting their advance." "Let them approach," Og responded with forced bravado. "They are nothing more than homeless nomads. Their numbers cannot compare to ours. We are giants. We are the lineage of the Rephaim. Let them taste our fury and witness how they crumble beneath our weapons." Yet deep in his heart, he sensed this confrontation would be unlike any he had previously faced. This was not merely about warriors clashing on a battlefield. There was something more at stake, something that transcended the conventional logic of warfare. On the night before the great battle, Og sat upon his iron bedstead, his gaze fixed upon the distant horizon. Sleep eluded him completely. Outside, his army rested confidently, assured of victory. But within the giant King of Bashan, a profound unease had taken root. From the enemy encampment, a strange sound drifted on the evening breeze. It was not the clash of weapons being prepared, or the boastful cries of warriors. Instead, it was a chant, a hymn that floated through the air like a prayer, a whisper directed toward a power that Og could not comprehend or conquer through conventional means. For the first time in his existence, Og felt diminished, not in physical stature, but in something far more fundamental. Despite his strength, despite his noble lineage, despite his iron throne, he sensed he was about to face something that could not be defeated with a sword. The stories of this invisible god haunted his thoughts. Tales spoke of one who commanded the elements themselves, who could part seas and rain fire from heaven, who fought battles not through mortal warriors but through divine intervention. Could such accounts possibly be true? Dawn approached, painted in crimson and gold, as if the heavens themselves foretold the blood that would soon be spilled on the plains of Edrei. The destiny of an entire lineage hung in the balance. Og rose from his iron bed and strode with determined steps toward the great courtyard where his army awaited. Tens of thousands of warriors, tall and mighty descendants of the ancient Rephaim, stood ready for their king's command. "Today we fight not merely for Bashan," Og proclaimed, his voice carrying across the assembled multitudes. "And today we fight for our heritage, for our bloodline, for the right to prove that giants shall not fall before common men." In the distance, a cloud of dust began to rise, not from any storm, but from the relentless advance of the Israelite army. Og's scouts returned with faces etched in tension and uncertainty. "They are numerous, my lord, but it is not their quantity that disturbs us," one reported, his voice barely concealing his apprehension. Unlike the armies Og had previously encountered, these Israelites did not advance with war cries or boastful proclamations of anticipated victory. Instead, they marched in an eerie silence, as if they already knew the battle was won before it had even begun. At the front of this mysterious host stood no towering warrior nor monarch adorned with gold and precious stones. There was only a man, a general chosen by his God, named Joshua. Og observed him with contempt initially. "This mortal believes he can challenge me," the giant king thought. Yet a wave of uncertainty coursed down his spine as he recalled the stories. Was this not the same people whose God had toppled walls with mere trumpet sounds? Was this not the same deity who had split the sea in two? The sun climbed higher above the battlefield. The waiting had ended. With a ferocious roar that seemed to shake the very foundations of the earth, Og raised his massive sword and gave the command to attack. The giants of Bashan charged with the force of an avalanche. Each step they took caused the ground to quake beneath them. Each blow they struck felled dozens of enemies. The Israelites appeared smaller, more fragile. Yet they fought with an unshakable conviction that defied explanation. But something extraordinary marked their struggle. They did not fight with rage or desperation. They fought with faith. And the more of them that fell, the stronger their chanting became. As if each warrior knew with absolute certainty that they were not alone in this battle. Og advanced like an unleashed colossus, his sword carving arcs of death around him. No one could stand against his might. But then, a sudden blow struck him from behind. He staggered, feeling pain, something he had not experienced in years. He looked at his arm and saw blood flowing freely. Lifting his gaze, he witnessed the Israelites advancing with unstoppable determination. But what disturbed him most was the sight of Joshua standing motionless atop a nearby hill, his arms extended toward heaven. The man was not fighting, not commanding in any conventional sense, as if it were not he who directed this battle but something infinitely greater. "This cannot be possible," Og muttered, his confidence beginning to crack like ice under spring sun. Suddenly, a tremendous crash shook the earth. Lightning fell from the sky, illuminating the battlefield with blinding radiance. Og felt an invisible force strike him, pushing him backward. His knees buckled beneath him. His sword, which had been an extension of his own will for countless years, fell from his trembling hands. For the first time in his existence, Og the giant of Bashan experienced something utterly foreign to his nature, genuine fear. The sky darkened ominously. Storm clouds gathered over Edrei with supernatural speed. Og attempted to rise, but the weight of battle, the weight of destiny itself, proved too overwhelming. He looked toward Joshua, who now walked toward him with disturbing calm. "I am not the one who has conquered you, Ogi," Joshua declared, his voice carrying across the battlefield with divine authority. "It is the Lord, the God of Israel, who has sealed your fate." Og, the Titan of Bashan, found himself on his knees for the first time. The earth, stained crimson with blood, seemed to absorb his fall like an echo of history being written in that very moment. The giant struggled to stand, but his body no longer responded with its former strength. His muscles, once capable of crushing fortress walls, trembled under a burden he had never known, the weight of divine judgment. Joshua paused before him, his robes flowing in the wind. He carried no sword, showed no fury of conquest. He simply gazed upon the fallen giant with that unsettling calm that proved more disturbing than any threat. "Who are you?" Og gasped, his voice barely above a whisper. "I am not the one who has defeated you, Og. It is the God of Israel who has decreed your destiny." Og raised his eyes toward the heaven, now completely shrouded in dark clouds. In that instant, he understood something that no amount of physical strength could overcome. No matter how tall a giant might stand, there was always something greater still. The storm erupted with a thunderous roar, and with it, the final battle of Og reached its inevitable conclusion. The Israelites swept through Bashan like a divinely ordained flood, claiming what had once been the undisputed domain of giants. The walls that had seemed indestructible crumbled before their advance, conquered not by siege engines or superior tactics, but by something far more powerful. The very names of the Rephaim were erased from history, as if their existence had been nothing more than vapor on the wind. Og's massive form, which had once served as a symbol of unassailable power, now lay motionless upon the blood-soaked earth. His immense figure was observed by the conquering army with a mixture of awe and reverent fear. The last giant had fallen, and with him an entire era had come to its end. But the story of Og did not conclude with his death. His iron bedstead, that monument which had once represented his supremacy over all mortal men, was preserved as a relic, a tangible testament to the truth that even the mightiest can be brought low. Future generations would gaze upon it and remember that no earthly power, regardless of its apparent invincibility, could stand against the will of the Almighty. Years flowed past like rivers returning to the sea, and the accounts of Og transformed from recent memory into enduring legend. Travelers would whisper tales around campfires, speaking of the nights when the moon hung full in the star-scattered sky, and fierce winds howled across the desolate plains of Bashan. On such evenings, and they claimed, one could still hear the thunderous footsteps echoing among the mountains, the restless spirit of the giant king who could never accept his defeat. Some maintained that his soul had never truly departed from his beloved land, that it continued to wander the ancient pathways, eternally guarding what had once been his kingdom. Others insisted that his story served as a divine warning, a haunting reminder that the pride of giants could never successfully challenge the sovereignty of heaven. The Iron Bed became a pilgrimage destination for those seeking to understand the mysteries of divine power versus human strength. Scholars and sages would journey great distances to examine this relic, measuring its extraordinary dimensions and marveling at the craftsmanship that had created a resting place for a being of such incredible proportions. "Behold," they would say to their students and followers, "the couch of Og, King of Bashan. See how mighty he was, how his very bed required the labor of master smiths and the strength of many men to construct. Yet for all his power, for all his terrible strength, he could not stand against the God of a people who possessed nothing but faith." The lesson was not lost on subsequent generations. Kings and conquerors would visit the site and contemplate the fate of Og, understanding that no amount of physical might or earthly dominion could guarantee victory against divine will. The greatest fortress could be breached, the strongest army could be routed, and even the most imposing giant could be felled by forces beyond mortal comprehension. As centuries passed, the land of Bashan was settled by new peoples who built their homes upon the foundations where giants once walked. They cultivated the fertile fields where epic battles had been fought, and they raised their children in the shadow of mountains that had witnessed the fall of titans. Yet the memory of Og persisted, woven into the fabric of local folklore and religious instruction. Mothers would tell their children the tale of the giant king who thought himself greater than God, and how his pride led to his destruction. Priests and teachers used his story as an illustration of divine justice, showing how the Almighty humbles the proud and lifts up the faithful. The Iron Bed remained, weathered by time but still intact, still bearing witness to truths that transcended the ages. It spoke silently of the folly of challenging heaven, of the temporary nature of earthly power, and of the eternal principle that faith could move mountains and topple giants. In the broader narrative of biblical history, Og's defeat became one of the crucial victories that established Israel in the Promised Land. It demonstrated that no obstacle was too great when the people trusted in their God, no enemy too powerful to be overcome by divine intervention. The Chronicles of ancient Israel would forever record the victory over Og as one of their most significant triumphs, not merely because of the territory gained or the enemy defeated, but because of what it represented in the grander tapestry of divine purpose. Here was proof that the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob was indeed the sovereign ruler of all creation, one who could humble the mightiest and establish his people against impossible odds. But Og's legacy extended far beyond his military defeat. In the final analysis, he was not remembered solely as a warrior who fell in battle, but as a symbol of the eternal conflict between human pride and divine sovereignty. His story became a teaching tool for generations, illustrating the fundamental truth that true greatness was not measured by physical stature or earthly power, but by wisdom sufficient to recognize what lay beyond mortal comprehension. The irony of Og's fate was not lost on the scribes who recorded his story. He who had challenged the God of Israel had unwittingly become one of history's greatest testimonies to that same God's power. His iron bed, preserved as a monument, served as a constant reminder that even the most impressive achievements of human strength were temporary and fragile when set against eternal purposes. Religious scholars of later generations would study Og's account and draw profound lessons about the nature of divine judgment. They observed that God had not simply destroyed the giant in a fit of arbitrary wrath, but had given him every opportunity to recognize the futility of opposition to heaven's will. The very miracles that preceded Israel's arrival in his territory, the crossing of the Jordan, the fall of Jericho, had served as clear warnings of the power he was about to confront. Og's choice to stand and fight, rather than surrender or seek peace, revealed the tragic blindness that pride can bring to even the most powerful individuals. He possessed every advantage that the world could offer: immense strength, a vast kingdom, loyal armies, and unassailable fortifications. Yet none of these could protect him when he set himself in opposition to the purposes of the Almighty. The story resonated through the ages because it addressed questions that every human being eventually faces. What is the source of true power? How should mortals relate to the divine? What is the proper response when faced with evidence of supernatural authority? Og's example provided clear answers to these eternal queries. He demonstrated that earthly might, no matter how impressive, was ultimately insignificant when measured against heavenly power. His defeat showed that the wise response to divine revelation was humble submission, not defiant resistance. As the centuries rolled on, other kingdoms would rise and fall. Other mighty rulers would build monuments to their own glory, and other giants, both literal and metaphorical, would believe themselves invincible. Yet the lesson of Og remained constant. That which opposes the will of heaven is destined for destruction, while that which aligns with divine purpose endures forever. The transformation of his story from historical event to moral instruction reflected the broader purpose of biblical narrative. These accounts were preserved not merely as records of what had happened, but as guides for understanding how the eternal interacted with the temporal, how the infinite God worked through finite human events to accomplish his purposes. Pilgrims who visited the site of ancient Bashan in later years would often reflect on the dramatic reversal that had taken place there. Where once a giant had ruled with apparently unshakable authority, now children played in fields where he had once inspired terror. The cycle of human pride and divine humbling had played out once again, as it would continue to do throughout history. In the end, Og of Bashan became immortal not for the reasons he had intended. Rather than being remembered as an unconquerable king, he was preserved in memory as a cautionary tale about the dangers of challenging heaven. His massive bed remained as a silent witness to the truth that no human achievement, however impressive, could stand against the purposes of the Almighty. Thus concluded the saga of the last giant, whose fall marked not just the end of an individual life or even a dynasty, but the closing of an entire chapter in the divine story of redemption. The age of the Rephaim had ended, and the age of Israel's inheritance had begun, all according to the eternal plan of the God who moves in mysterious ways to accomplish his perfect will. The greatest man who challenged God and Moses had learned too late that true greatness lies not in opposition to the divine, but in humble recognition of one who is greater than all earthly powers combined.